The lesson on this morning comes to us from Exodus chapter 20. This is number 4 of God's Big Ten, by the way, the fourth commandment that Moses brings down. And God spoke all these words and said, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Does this seem odd to everybody? This no transcripts over here and no one sitting over there. I was sure somebody would sit in that pew over there. I just thought someone's going to sit right. You started to, didn't you? Yeah. So thank you for your patience as we're undergoing a little bit of a renovation here. And next Sunday when you come, this side will be done and this side won't be. So we're just going to do some sort of fruit basket turnover here for a few days. But thanks for your help with that. So our great-grandparents called it the Holy Sabbath. Our grandparents called it the Sabbath. Our parents called it Sunday. We call it the weekend. It's understandable why this time is so important to many of us, isn't it? For with the drive that borders near the neurotic, we Americans hit the floor at 6 a.m., then we drop exhausted at midnight, scarcely able to remember what transpired during that 18-hour episode of relentless actions and words. And we do it consistently 5 or 6 days a week. So when Friday or Saturday afternoon gets here, it's not just the end of a 40-hour work week for most folks. It is truly yabba-dabba-do time for a lot of people. Even then, however, we don't always turn to rest or to relaxation. The weekend is the opportunity to try to catch up on the laundry and the yard work and the bill paying and the other chores we don't have time to do during the weekend. If you have children, you're probably at the ball field for a baseball game or for a soccer match or something. And then if we do take time for fun, we sometimes go about even that in a work-like manner. We don't just do sports, we do extreme sports, as though life were not extreme enough as it is. All of which means that if God is going to get our attention, then he better plan on making an appointment, taking a number, or pulling us over with a flashing blue light on the freeway. Otherwise, forget it. All of which is why these ancient words on the fourth and longest commandment here in Exodus 20 may sound a bit strange to many people today. As important as they surely are, they simply don't seem to reflect the reality of life for most people today. Living in the 21st century? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Sure, this was a big deal for those ancient Hebrews. Words similar to these appear not just here in the 10 laws given to Moses, but throughout the book of Exodus, before that, second chapter of Genesis, afterwards in the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, Isaiah. Numbers 15 even tells us, in fact, of a man who was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day and was put to death for it. So the good Jews not only knew this law, they enforced it. So much so that by the time of Jesus, no other aspect of the Hebrew faith was so surrounded by conflict and controversy as was this one. For the Pharisees in particular were masters at figuring out what was work and what wasn't. From the time that the ceremonial trumpet sounded on a Friday evening, in fact, they had determined that folks were not only not supposed to do any agricultural labor, they weren't even supposed to walk more than about a half a mile, 6/10 of a mile, outside of the city limits, because to do so would be working. They found ways around it, by the way. If you left some food 6/10 of a mile away, you could go to that and say that that's now my home, and then go another 6/10 from there. But before we too quickly dismiss those Pharisees as simply strange and long ago fanatics, we should remember that even in our own history, the Puritans, for all the many good things which they represented, truly had a fixation on the fourth commandment as well. Few other religious traditions ever provided a greater list of shall nots for Sabbath keeping as the American Puritans did. Like the Pharisees, they banned travel, they banned cooking, they banned agricultural work, they banned whistling, they banned kissing on Sunday. They squelched so much that H.L. Mencken once defined Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. So the result of all of this kind of thinking was indeed to produce for those Puritans a similar spirit as it had for the Pharisees before them, summed up in an austere and unbending faith that was unattractive and out of reach to most people. No work on Sunday also came to mean no fun on Sundays. Sort of like your mother used to tell you, if you were sick enough not to go to school on a weekday, then you're too sick to watch TV or to play as well. I have a feeling a lot of folks still suffer from that same unappealing understanding about the Sabbath. Many people think, for instance, that keeping the Sabbath simply means coming to church. Now, that's a habit which I would obviously endorse, but not merely as a matter of meeting the requirements of the religious law. See, I understand sometimes coming to church is difficult. Other times just sitting through a service is hard to do, isn't it? Particularly if you're worn out from the week. I've got to tell you, that's why I'm never really offended if people fall asleep in church. I figure that they really need the rest. And it's good that the church can provide that for them. But if keeping the Sabbath is not just about coming to church and surviving the services, then how should we understand it? Let me suggest to you two simple ideas. First, keeping the Sabbath is about setting aside time for rest and genuine renewal in our lives. Not just spiritual, but physical, mental, and emotional. Just to put it most simply, we all do need the rest, don't we? Whether we have recognized it or not. The idea of a Sabbath rest is one that is built into the very framework of creation itself. For just as God rested, so we read, so ought you and I. Some time ago, I happened to read of a Swiss scientist in Basel who calculated that a night's rest does not balance out a day's work for most folks. The average person breathes in 30 ounces of oxygen during Monday's work, but he or she uses 31. So at the close of the day, if you're average like the Swiss, you will be 1 ounce of oxygen short. And when you go to sleep, you will breathe in more oxygen than you use, but still won't be quite enough. When morning comes, according to this scientist's work, we will have gotten about 5/6 of that ounce of oxygen back. It's going to leave us in debt to nature for the other part of it. So when Sunday comes, we've ended up a whole ounce behind, a whole day behind. That is why we get sleepy on Sunday afternoons, or maybe even during the sermon. It couldn't be the pastor's fault, of course. So if we don't rest from that day, we'll be out of balance from that point on. Not on whether his calculations were correct or not. But what is clearly undeniable is that every time in human history when people have tried to dismantle the Sabbath or even just ignore it for very long, the results have been disastrous. The Frenchman Voltaire, for instance, believed that if he was going to actually abolish Christianity in his country, he had to start by abolishing the Sabbath. when they tried to substitute one day in 10 for one in 7 as a day of rest during the time of the Revolution in France. Horses and men began to break down in the streets under the strain. During that period, there were more suicides in Paris in proportion to the population than in any other city in all of Europe. And why? Because the idea of the Sabbath rest is one that was indeed ordered into human life from the very beginning by the very one who made us as his creatures. Now, I want to suggest to you, it doesn't matter which day of the week you take for your Sabbath. Jews and Adventists take Saturdays, Muslims take Fridays, Persians take Thursdays. Most Christians take this day, Sundays, at least since the Common Era began. But whenever it is, what's important is that we take at least one of them. For in the end, truly keeping the Sabbath is about setting aside time for rest and renewal. That's what the Hebrew word Shabbat means. It means to desist, to cease from exertion. Now, I understand, of course, that even just relaxing does not come automatically to everybody, especially to type A personalities who think we have to be doing something every moment of every day to justify our continued existence on this planet. But we can begin to learn how to perhaps rest by loosening up the tight wires of our lives, as one has put it. Learning not to take ourselves so seriously, nor our jobs. As the ancient Greeks used to say, you will break the bow if you keep it always stretched. Now, some folks will not appreciate these words, but I'm certain like my friend Chuck Swindoll once said, that a relaxed, easygoing Christian is miles more attractive than the rigid, uptight brother who squeaks when he walks and whines when he talks. If you want to keep the Sabbath, set aside a regular time for relaxing and for rest. But second, and even more important, keeping the Sabbath is about setting aside time for God. A process which at times may or may not involve merely coming to a worship service somewhere. See, in the Sabbath, I believe that rather than you and I saying, okay, God, I'm here now, let's get it over with, it is God who is saying to us in the Sabbath, I'm available for you. This is why this commandment in Exodus 20 falls smack dab in the middle of the other 9 commandments that tell us about how we ought to act towards our fellow man and how we ought to act towards God. This commandment is not essentially about what God forbids at all. It's about what God is offering, which is the invitation, the privilege, the blessing to worship him in holiness and in truth. It's what forms the basis for the great commandment Jesus mentions later on. You remember the one, the summons to love the Lord with all of your heart and mind and soul and strength. As important as church going is, this law isn't about that. It's about setting aside the time for a real relationship with the one who made us. The old hymn says it, take time to be holy, speak oft with thy Lord, spend much time in secret with Jesus alone. Now that may mean coming to church. It may mean attending a Sunday school class. It may mean showing up for an evening Bible study or being in a home group. We should recognize that long before the church ever shifted the ceremonial observances of our faith, organized worship services of the gathered community, over to the first day from the seventh day in honor of the resurrection, that the moral observance of the Sabbath was already had been established. And the moral understanding of this fourth commandment is that we plainly give a due portion of our time over to the worship and service of God. And why is that? Well, it is because it's the same reason. Many of you will remember this. Some of you that are younger will not. Long before cell phones were even thought of, when some of us went off to college, we lined up at that one payphone. That's what a payphone looks like for our younger people. We lined up at that one payphone at the end of the hall in the dorm on Sunday evenings when the rates were cheaper. to call our parents. And why did we do that? Well, to ask for more money, of course. But more fundamentally, it was because we knew that our parents still wanted to have a relationship with us, even if we were no longer living under their roof. Remembering the Sabbath is above all about setting aside time for God, who has already set aside time for you and for me. Jesus reminded those who would criticize him, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You see, our God is about relationships, not simply rules. The words of Isaiah 58 speak powerfully on this point to me. Listen to verses 13 and 14 of Isaiah 58, words which the prophet said came from the mouth of the Lord himself. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's day honorable, if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride on the heights of the land and feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. Do you hear the incredible, beautiful promise in these words? If you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's day honorable, then you will find your joy in the Lord. I'm certain I can tell you this morning that what a lot of us do every Sunday is not appropriate if we truly want to set aside this day and keep it special. Much of it, in fact, is going our way and doing as we please, rather than stopping to consider what the Lord would want us to do or to say. In fact, for some church folks, Sundays are harder than any other day of the week. I'm always amused when I hear that old Lionel Richie song on the radio. You know the one, I'm easy like Sunday morning. Yeah, Lionel, come try this for a while. But what I would say to you simply is this. The real hollowness of Sunday is nothing less than the opportunity to regularly renew and deepen our relationship with a God who has set aside his time to meet with us in love. And the true holiness of the Sabbath is not in what you and I may or may not do with it. It is in what God has already done with it, by blessing it with his own presence for any who desire to worship him. So have you found your joy in the Lord? If not, maybe here's a good place to start looking. Not out of this duty, out of desire. Not out of the law, out of love. Ask yourself, is there anything recognizably special about your Sundays? Anything which sets them apart from the other 6 days of the week? Anything which marks them and you as holy before the Lord? Hear the word of the Lord once more. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. We do need the rest. And even more, we need the relationship. Blessed are those who find their joy in the Lord. They will ride to the heights of the land and feast on an inheritance indeed. Amen.